Good afternoon again. We have reserved the very best for the last, and our final topic for today's 4 presentation program is understanding U.S. Middle East relations. And this presentation will be by Ambassador Feisal Istrabadi. It's a great honor for me to introduce him. He is a McRobbie Professor in Global Strategic Studies, Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies, founding director of the Center for the Study of Middle East, and affiliated faculty at the Center for Constitutional Democracy, Indiana University, Bloomington. Ambassador Istrabadi focuses his research on constitutional issues, problems in engendering rule of law institutions, and post-conflict justice issues in the Middle East. He is an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. A double alumnus of Indiana University, Ambassador Istrabadi was appointed Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary and Deputy Permanent Representative of Iraq to the United Nations in 2004 and served in the office of the Minister for Foreign Affairs from 2010 to 2012. His lectures often at universities and policy institutions. He lectures often at universities and policy institutes and appears frequently in national and international media. By way of education, he is SJD from Northwestern University, LLM, Northwestern University, JD, Indiana University, Moore School of Law. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Ambassador Feisal Istrabadi. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for your center for sponsoring this program today. Please take it over.
Thank you very much, Professor. It is a great privilege to be here and a great privilege to count you personally as well as your institution, including the International Studies Association of Georgia as a partner institution. We are privileged to work with you all, and I am delighted to join you this afternoon. So let me see if I can do this. Let me share my screen. I don't have a lot of slides. I don't like PowerPoint, but let's see if I can figure out how to do a slideshow while also sharing my screen. Slideshow from the beginning. There we go. So hopefully that is visible to everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about giving an introduction in the next, I think I have an hour and a half to speak about the U.S. relations in the Middle East. I'm going to try to be relatively brief, speak for somewhere between a half hour and 45 minutes. And hopefully we can have the rest of the time for discussion. If I do say something that doesn't make sense or that you're curious about, would like to interrupt me, raise your hand or do something, feel free to do that. I usually can get back to where I wanted to be and usually end up saying what I wanted to say. So, you know, what I very much hope this turns into is a discussion rather than a lecture. But nonetheless, I have a few things that I think are important for me to say, and then we will turn to what you think is important to discuss. As I said, I don't have a lot of slides. I love maps. I collect maps, in fact, and I always begin my lectures on the Middle East with my public lectures on the Middle East with a map of the region, so we know sort of roughly what it is that we are talking about. I'm going to focus mostly on sort of three things. One is the United States relations with Iran, or rather, maybe relations is too optimistic a word, the situation involving the United States and Iran. The other is sort of broadly other Gulf issues. And I am not taking a position. The map here says Persian Gulf. I'm perfectly happy. Since I'm a professor in the Department of Central Eurasian Studies, I'm perfectly happy to have it be called the Persian Gulf but as a Middle East Studies Center director, I'm aware that others prefer to have it be called the Arabian Gulf. I am agnostic about this, and will simply refer to it as the Gulf. So that is the Gulf when I speak. I will say my grandfather, whose hobby was map making, had actually a couple of atlases published early, about 100 years ago, just about in the 1920s. They had a couple of atlases published in Vienna, as a matter of fact, and but he also has a map of what he called Arabian Asia. It's in Arabic, the map, but I have a copy of it framed at home, and he calls it the Gulf of Basra. Basra being the southernmost city in Iraq. I have proposed that it be called the Gulf of Basra, but neither my Iran specialist colleagues nor my Arab specialist colleagues have agreed to that, what I think is a very reasonable compromise. But anyway, here we are, and this is what I hope to talk about. Now, I want to begin with a slide which I've used at a couple of my talks, and a lot of times people think it's photoshopped. For those who don't follow sort of the news of the Middle East, and it is in fact a genuine photograph. It is not photoshopped, and this is President Trump's first visit to the Middle East within the first couple of months of his presidency. It's a very odd photograph, but it is a photograph of the president of Egypt, the king of Saudi Arabia. This photograph was taken in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, and the president of the United States. You can see the first lady there. Her face is sort of behind her husband's, opening a terrorism center in Riyadh, an anti-terrorism center, which is government sponsored by Saudi Arabia. And what they've got their hands on this orb, and I'm not sure what the symbolism is supposed to be, but it is a globe. You can sort of see, I think that's North America underneath President, or maybe that's just a shout of his hand, I can't tell. But in any event, so this was sort of the Middle East, the opening of the Trump administration's foray into the Middle East, which resulted in a number of policies that, of course, we still live with. Just because the administration has changed, policies that President Trump put into place are things, it's not like, say, some of the administrative regulations that the previous administration, that the former president put into place, can be undone by a new administration. That happens routinely. Executive orders are rescinded, especially when parties change, when party control of the White House changes. Executive orders are rescinded, new executive orders are signed. Regulations can be changed if the regulatory process is followed. In foreign policy, it's a little bit more like an ocean-going vessel that takes time to reverse course, and in some instances, the course is very, very difficult to reverse. Now, it's interesting that this is obviously is intended to convey a sense of closeness to some of U.S. allies in the region, some of the Arab allies in the region, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, neither one of which would exactly be an exemplar of democratic rule and the rule of law in the developing world. Both are very highly centralized autocratic states. And at roughly the same moment that this photograph was taken, somewhat subsequently, this photograph was taken, maybe a couple of years later, perhaps I should say. And I say that because I see John Bolton right here. He was National Security Advisor at the time. And here you see, I mean, the expression picture tells is worth 1,000 words. This photograph really is worth 1,000 words. It is the United States with some of its with the leaders of some of its president of the United States with the leaders of some of the United States' closest European allies, notably, of course, the former Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel. Here you see Macron, the one sort of standing in between, trying to emulate Trump's body language, is the Prime Minister of Japan, who made was probably the only one of the major sort of so-called Western allies to ensure that he maintained very close relations with the United States, regardless of who the president may or may not have been. But I think that the two photographs in juxtaposition with one another sort of tell a tale, I think, of sort of the comfort, I would say, of the previous president with being in the company of autocratic leaders versus the leaders of some of the democracies of Western Europe and Japan. Make of that what you will. I just think it's an interesting juxtaposition of photographs. I remember when President Obama was given an award by a medal by the King of Saudi Arabia. President Obama, being much taller than the King of Saudi Arabia, had to sort of bow down to let the king put it's a medal on a chain that goes around the neck, sort of over the shoulders. So he sort of bowed down to let the King of Saudi Arabia put that medal around his neck. That created a tremendous kerfuffle of the President of the United States being seen as bowing to the King of Saudi Arabia, when President Trump was given exactly the same award, the same medal, and made exactly the same gesture to allow the King of Saudi Arabia to put the medal around his neck. And I sort of wish I had photographs of that. There was, of course, dead silence, no criticism whatsoever. I say all of that because, unfortunately, that is the political climate that we are in. I'm not taking, for purposes of this public talk, not taking a position one way or the other, simply pointing out that in this climate, even foreign policy becomes fodder for the political class. Some of us are old enough to remember when the rule was that politics end at the sort of the shores of the United States, and once you got outside the United States, we were all Americans and all of that. That is no longer the case, and that is, I think, something that we have lost as a polity in this country. But it is having an effect, I think, to some extent on the direction of foreign policy, and in particular in respect to some of the issues that arise in the Middle East. So let me look at Iran and say a few things. That, of course, is a map of Iran. As I said, I love maps, and that is. That's Iran, which, as you can see, dominates sort of the northern Persian Gulf. Iraq, here you see, barely is almost not quite a landlocked country. And Kuwait, of course, this is Saudi Arabia, this is Qatar. Bahrain is a tiny blip over here somewhere. This is the United Arab Emirates, and this is sort of sticking out here, kind of at the junction or whatever of the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, is Oman. Now, where I want to begin then, because it's been in the news, is on the Iran nuclear file and the developments, and that's been in the news just in the last 2 or 3 days, when the Biden administration gave a briefing to senators of the, I think senators, maybe congressmen as well, of the, or members of Congress of the intelligence committees up on Capitol Hill, gave them a briefing on the Iran nuclear file, noting that Iran's state of enrichment, uranium enrichment, is such that their ability to produce nuclear grade fissile material can now be measured in the time frame of weeks rather than months, which is, if true, a development indeed. So let me talk for a moment about how we got here. And the starting point for me is going to be the so-called JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, often referred to as the nuclear deal or the nuclear agreement. And I just want to give some of the highlights. The agreement itself is something like 150, 160 pages long with appendices. It ends up getting passed by the United Nations Security Council and put obligations and responsibilities on both sides. The agreement was negotiated with the United States, with the 5 permanent members of the Security Council: the United States, the Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, France, and the United Kingdom, and Germany. It's the P5+1. So that's the P5+1 on one side and Iran on the other. Pursuant to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Iran assumed these obligations. This is back in about 2014, I believe, during the relatively closing days, the last half of the second term of the Obama administration, which succeeded in making this agreement. Now, I should point something out. The George W. Bush administration had been negotiating with Iran on a nuclear agreement as far back as 2003, 4, 5, in that time period. The United States walked away from making an agreement with Iran at that time. That agreement would have limited Iran far more than the JCPOA did when it was negotiated about a decade later. And the reason for that is that Iran did not begin the negotiations with the P5+1 in the Obama administration, where the negotiations had ended with the Bush administration. Iran's position was, you didn't take the deal we were willing to agree to at the time, a decade ago. We're not negotiating against ourselves. We start from the beginning. It may very well be, and I personally predicted, others did too, that the same would happen after the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018, something that I will get to in a minute, that Iran would not simply agree to go back to where the JCPOA left off and negotiate from there. And that appears to be what has been going on. But the agreement that Iran made under the JCPOA was that it would limit its enrichment of uranium. Let's be very clear. Under international law, and specifically under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to which Iran is a signatory, and let me be clear, if Iran ever reaches the day that it explodes a nuclear device, it will be in violation of its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as well as obligations under Security Council resolutions. Having said that, under the NPT, states are allowed to enrich uranium to a certain level. I believe it is 3.5% roughly, because there are civilian uses for radioactive isotopes in research, in energy production, for instance, in medical treatment, etc. So there is a legitimate point of enrichment that states are allowed under the existing normative legal structure regulating the international normative legal structure regulating the uses of regulating enrichment. Let's be specific. Under the JCPOA, the Iranians agreed to reduce the number of centrifuges that they have from 16,000 down to 6,000. This is the method that is used. This is the easiest, I suppose. It's not easy. The technology is not that difficult it's very expensive. So it's not that difficult. I mean, obviously the technology dates back to the end of the Second World War. It's not exactly cutting edge technology, but it's expensive and delicate so that states can do it. Fortunately, you and I cannot make nuclear bombs in our basements. But nonetheless, it requires centrifugation to enrich. You take the stuff that piles up at the very bottom of the centrifuge. The heaviest stuff goes down to the bottom when you centrifuge, and you keep doing that until you refine more and more and more to a higher and higher percentage of enriched uranium. So the reduction of centrifuges by more than a third, or about a third, was significant. More significant, in my view, and I am not an expert on the technical aspect of any of this, is that the amount of enriched uranium that Iran was allowed to store was reduced from the approximately 10,000 kilograms that Iran had at the time of the JCPOA down to 300 kilograms. As you can see, a significant reduction. For anybody not familiar with kilograms, the conversion from kilograms to pounds is you multiply by 2.2. So that is a reduction from 22,000 pounds of enriched uranium down to 660 pounds of enriched uranium. The estimate was that increased the time for Iran to reach weapons grade uranium from 10 years. Now, of course, you can tell me, well, okay, that was 2000, whatever it was, 14 or thereabouts. We're now in 2022. That meant 2 years from now. That's true. But that's not quite how it worked, because while the agreement was in place, that 10 years is a constant. So if the agreement were still in place today, it would be 10 years from now. Now, what you can say to me is that parts of the agreement begin to expire 15 years from 2004, 2005. I'm sorry, 2014, 2015. This is all the Obama administration. And that's 2029, 2030, parts of it start to expire. That's true. But the 10 years would still be in place if everybody was abiding, or if everybody were abiding by this agreement. Keep in mind that to get to a usable nuclear weapon, there are several steps. First, all this enrichment and so on. Second, you actually have to master the technology of controlling a nuclear explosion. You've got to make a pretty big boom, usually somewhere underground. Okay. Third, you have to have a way of delivering the device to an intended target. That requires mastering intercontinental ballistic technology. That's not that tough either. If you can launch a satellite into space to orbit the Earth, you have mastered more or less the technology for an intercontinental ballistic missile. Instead of shooting it straight up, you give it a trajectory to come back down in some form of parabolic, in some type of a parabola, I suppose. But then is the tough part. Taking that thing that you made that makes a big explosion, and put in your mind how big the atomic bombs were that were dropped on Japan. Now you have to miniaturize that, be able to fit it onto the top of the intercontinental ballistic missile, launch it, and have it re-enter and land without destroying itself. That's a significant technological step, as I understand it. So having fissile material sufficient to make a nuclear bomb is a necessary but not sufficient condition to constituting a threat. Now, of course, if you're not aiming at the United States, if you're aiming at the neighbors, maybe you don't need an intercontinental ballistic missile. But the days of flying an airplane that takes hours and hours to get there, those are behind us with satellite technologies and so on. That's not a credible threat to anyone outside of your immediate neighborhood, because that takes too long and you can be intercepted, as opposed to the minutes that it takes for missiles to hit their targets. Now, let me move a little more quickly. There were also there was a deuterium reactor, a heavy water reactor in a place called Iraq, that not to be confused with Iraq. This is a place in Iran that was redesigned. The spent fuels were shipped out of Iran, and that effectively blocks the ability of Iran to make a plutonium nuclear weapon. Uranium is still an available path for it, but plutonium, as I understand it from people who know what they're talking about in terms of the technical aspects, that is gone. There was also in place a verification arrangement, not only under the original Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, but the so-called additional protocol to the NPT, which had even more strict guidelines and required reporting, import-export reporting requirements of those states that have ratified the NPT. I happen to know, rather the additional protocol, I happen to know something about the additional protocol because when I was an ambassador, Iraq acceded to the additional protocol, and I did a preliminary legal analysis of what that required, of the mechanisms that Iraq was going to have to establish in order to discharge its obligations through the International Atomic Energy Agency and its monitoring protocols. It allowed for IAEA inspectors and surveillance. There were actual cameras set up in labs across Iran. And the IAEA, through the additional protocol and the mechanisms it created pursuant thereto, to monitor procurement channels. And a lot of times people will say something like, well, surveillance is nonsense because, after all, if you've got to give notice. And if they know that there's going to be somebody showing up at the doorstep, all they have to do is clean it up. This isn't like taking a can of Pledge and spraying it on the tabletops and wiping it down with dust, right? You're using radioactive isotopes of uranium. That is going to be detectable long after you vacuum the place. And the IAEA inspectors know that, and so do the Iranians. So while I'm not saying that it's impossible to cheat, it ain't that easy either. Plus, there are, of course, satellites monitoring, access in and out, ingress and egress to the suspected nuclear sites. In exchange, very quickly, Iran got some sanctions relief. Not all the sanctions that were placed against Iran, but those sanctions that were placed on Iran only because of the nuclear file. There's a whole bunch of sanctions against Iran that are in place because of its perceived malfeasance around the Middle East, those sanctions remained in place. Only those sanctions put on place because of the nuclear file were eased. There was something called Snapback, which was that while the JCPOA was in place, you see, at the Security Council, of course, any one of the permanent 5 members can veto any non-procedural resolution. Any substantive or substantive resolution can be vetoed by a permanent member of the Security Council, the 5 states I've mentioned, including obviously the United States. The problem is, so if you lift sanctions, in order to get sanctions back on, you would normally have to have another vote. And someone like the Russians or the Chinese might well veto any reimposition of sanctions. So what the United States got an agreement from its other permanent partners on the Security Council. Partners is maybe too optimistic a term, but let me use it for the moment. Partners in the agreement. Is that if the IAEA certified that Iran was in violation of the JCPOA, the UN imposed sanctions would snap back automatically without the need for another vote by the Security Council. No one could veto the snapback. Okay? This is one of the things that the United States negotiated as a security against political discord between the P5 down the road, which has obtained, as a matter of fact, now, although we'll get back to that in a minute. And there were all kinds of US sanctions that were put in place. Some were put in place by Congress. Those could not be removed because Congress would not have passed the necessary legislation, but some were imposed by executive order. And of course, what the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. If a president signed an executive order to impose sanctions, another president, or indeed the same president, can sign another executive order to remove those sanctions. So those sanctions were removed, specifically the sanctions that had to do with the nuclear file, not the other sanctions that have to do with the foreign policy of Iran in the region. Those remained in place. And same story with the EU sanctions, the European Union sanctions. This is, well, I'm sort of getting ahead of the story. And so at this point, let me stop the share. I'll come back to, well, this is what, when the United, there's actually a photograph, which I actually thought I'd taken out because now I have to explain it. There's a photograph of the USS Abraham Lincoln, which when the United States withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, it sent this into the Persian Gulf carrier strike group, obviously with the intention of trying to threaten Iran or to suggest that a strike was imminent in the event neither the Bush administration, obviously not the Obama administration, nor the Trump administration actually undertook military action against Iran. Now, let me talk for a minute. I'll get back to my presentation when I move on. But let me just make a couple of points about the JCPOA and where we are today. I think it's important to know the background. If you want to assess or analyze a foreign policy issue, in my opinion, you have to know how you got here. This is how we got here. Throughout the time that the JCPOA was in force, the United Nations Atomic Energy Agency, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is headquartered in Vienna, certified that Iran was in compliance. The security, the intelligence services of the United States and its Western allies in the P5+1 all certified that Iran was in compliance. The Trump administration repeatedly certified in its first year in office that Iran was in compliance with the JCPOA. In May of 2018, with no evidence that Iran was not in compliance, the Trump administration announced the withdrawal of the United States from the JCPOA. This was done against the advice of the United States NATO allies, including the 3 NATO allies who were parties to the agreement, Germany, France, and the UK. But certain of America's allies in the region had advocated US withdrawal, and that is Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Israel. You will remember that when the Obama administration announced the JCPOA, a Republican-controlled Congress, this is not a political statement, it's a statement of fact, a Republican-controlled Congress invited the Prime Minister of Israel for a sight I have never seen, hope never to see again in my life, and that is a foreign head of government standing in the well of Congress, speaking out against United States foreign policy. It was an incredible sight to see. That's actually an issue I will return to in a moment. This is not a political statement. It's just I cannot conceive of having had a foreign head of government being invited to come to Washington to speak to a joint session of Congress in opposition to the foreign policy of the American administration. It's a major marker, in my view. It's a watershed moment in sort of the foreign policy of the United States and how partisan even the foreign policy of the United States has become in Washington. It's not a good sign for the United States generally, in my opinion, for what it's worth, which I leave to you. Be that as it may, for 1 year, Iran continued to abide by the obligations under the JCPOA. But the sanctions that are imposed on Iran have what's called a secondary effect, or result in what are called secondary sanctions. Secondary sanctions occur when, because of the sanctions imposed on Iran, states not Iran, like our allies in Europe, if they do business with Iran, become themselves subject to the same sanctions. And that includes not only the states, but foreign corporations, American corporations too, for that matter. For instance, when the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA, Iran had an order for several Boeing jets for the civilian national airlines. Those had to be canceled by Boeing, because if Boeing had delivered the planes or continued to accept payments on the contracts, Boeing could be sanctioned, and officers of the Boeing Corporation could be hauled off to jail. Well, the same is true of foreign corporations. There are also Airbus contracts which is the European sort of equivalent of Boeing. Those had to be canceled for the same reason. Those are secondary sanctions. So when you're France or Germany and you like selling Mercedes cars and BMWs in the United States, now you're faced with, do I cut myself off from the American market or from the Iranian market? Well, that's a no-brainer. Which market's bigger? Obviously, the United States. So you start abiding by the sanctions, even though they're not technically aimed at Germany, but because they're aimed at Iran. These are secondary sanctions. So the European states all began to abide by the American sanctions, which is a violation itself of the JCPOA, because the European states, especially the 3 states that were parties to the JCPOA, had agreed to stop the sanctions on Iran. And Iran went along for a year and then finally said, okay, well, if no one else is abiding by the JCPOA, why in the hell should we? Now, I don't like the Iranian government. Don't get me wrong. They've done a lot of harm in Iraq. But I have to say, I'd have come to the same conclusion if I were in the Iranian leadership. It's self-evident, it seems to me. Nobody, if I hired you to paint my house, and you came to paint my house, and I announced one fine day you're never going to see another dollar from me, would you still keep showing up every day to paint? I don't think so. Okay? So that's what happens. So now we're up to about 2019. Time comes. Iran announces that it is breaching the 20% threshold for enrichment, which is what, 6 times roughly the limit that JCPOA set on them. And that turns out to be a really important thing, the 20%, because it is not a linear curve that the higher you enrich, the greater the cost. The most difficult step is getting from wherever you are, zero-ish, to 20%. From 20 to 40 is much easier than from 0 to 20. And from 40 to 60, 60 to 80, then up to 90 plus, it gets easier. The difficult step is getting to 20. Once you've mastered that, the rest comes quickly. So they broke the 20, they broke the 10,000 kilogram, the 300 kilograms, they went past that long ago. All this is going on while the United States is trying to get them to get back to the negotiating table, and the Iranians simply refuse. It's easy to breach an agreement. It's a little harder than to come back into an agreement. And so where we have ended up, by the way, was, and this is why I showed the picture, I realize now I've gone on for a very long time about this. I'll try to make the rest of my presentation faster. But again, this has caught my attention because it's been in the news this week. What happened was that in October of 2020, just before the US elections, the United States had still, after a year and a half of trying, failed to get Iran to come back to the negotiating table. All of a sudden, the United States realized that in late October, a bunch of sanctions on conventional weapons were going to expire. And so it went back to the United Nations and tried to get the Security Council to reimpose those sanctions. Now, when the other states said to the United States, but you withdrew from the JCPOA, why are you trying to come back and now argue about whether or not Iran is in compliance with JCPOA? This response of the United States under the previous administration was, well, we withdrew from the application, but we're still a party to the agreement. And Professor Sashti is laughing. That was exactly the response of the Security Council, including from America's closest allies. It does not pass the laugh test. The United States demanded a vote. Only Honduras voted with the United States. Every other member of the Security Council, including America's closest allies, abstained. And of course, America's adversaries on the Security Council, Russia and China, voted no. It is the most humiliating defeat for the United States in the Security Council that I am aware of. I have never known a Security Council resolution proffered, tabled by the United States to get only the vote of the United States and one other Security Council member. It's just incredible to me. But that's where we are. What I want to suggest to you, and I'm going to do this very quickly because I want to move on, is that if I were running Iran, much as I oppose what the Iranian government does throughout the Middle East, and as an Iraqi, and I am a natural born citizen of both the United States and Iraq, one by virtue of where I was born, the other by virtue of to whom I was born. But if I were running Iran, I would go hell-bent for leather to create a nuclear device for this reason, not to threaten Israel, not to use, but for regime survival, as a guarantee for regime survival. I know of no other country that a sitting head of government, speaking from the rostrum of the General Assembly, has called for the bombing of, other than Iran. And if I were Iran, I'd take a look and see what happened to North Korea, where the President of the United States and the head of state of North Korea began to exchange love letters after North Korea became a nuclear power. That'd be the lesson I would learn. Iran's interest is, the leadership of Iran is interested in regime survival. I believe they see a nuclear weapon, if they have made the decision to get one, based upon regime survival. I'll be happy to answer questions here. I'm going to try to wrap up in the next few minutes, but I do want to talk about a couple of issues. Let me just, well, I guess I ought to talk a little bit about the Gulf. What we're seeing in the Gulf now is the rise of, I can't remember whether I'm sharing my screen or not right now.
No, you're not sharing the screen, sir. That's okay. Don't worry about it.
All right. That's fine. I can, this isn't, all right. So what is happening in the Gulf now is you've got a state, the United Arab Emirates, which is punching much higher than its weight. It has become a mover and shaker in Gulf affairs, which is an incredible thing. Something like 2/3 or 3/4 of the population of the United Arab Emirates are foreigners. They are not citizens of the UAE. Yet, because of its tremendous wealth and openness to investment, it has become an important player in the region. Now, it is under the American umbrella. There are US bases in the UAE, as there is in Qatar, as there is in Bahrain. There are no US bases in Saudi Arabia. But it is under the US protection. And it has been involved, for instance, in the Saudi war in Yemen, which has been ongoing now for 6 years for no particularly good reason, in my view, and from time to time flares up and is in the news. Now, Saudi Arabia has no army to speak of. The UAE does have an army, but it is an army that is made up of foreigners. One hesitates to use the word mercenaries. But their officer corps, for instance, other than the very senior field marshals, are Pakistani officers. The rank and file tend to be from the Gulf state of Oman. They have been involved in the war in Yemen since the Obama administration. That is when the war began. And the United States, although it did not participate directly in that war, the United States and the United Kingdom provided logistical support for Saudi Arabia and the UAE to take on the Houthis, who are allied with Iran. The problem is that the Houthis were allied with Iran. They were never a proxy of Iran's, as the media and many commentators argue they are. But what the bombing campaign has done is to make the Houthis more dependent on Iran and Iranian arms than was the case before. As Iran has developed its own drone technology, some of which it has reversed engineered from being able to shoot down American drones in the region. It has had a couple of lucky strikes. It's been able to bring down a couple of drones and reverse engineer from there. In any event, it has proliferated that technology, not nuclear technology. There is no known example of a nuclear state strike that. There is no known example of a state which has weapons of mass destruction proliferating those weapons of mass destruction to a non-state actor. But conventional technologies, sure. In any case, the Houthis have a colorable claim to being state actors, since they control some of the ground, at least in Yemen. They have been using these drones to attack Saudi Arabia, and most recently, about 10 days ago, to launch an attack in Abu Dhabi. They have been able also to attack shipping in international shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf from time to time. Unfortunately, that war seems to be going on. The United States has attempted to convince its Arab allies involved in that war to escalate down, or rather de-escalate, but it has unfortunately so far not been successful. And in the meantime, as the Houthis have improved their capabilities and now feel they can inflict, even if it's symbolic, some harm on the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, they seem to be inclined to do that rather than to de-escalate. It has been a humanitarian crisis in Yemen for the better part of half a decade, with disease, malnutrition, and outright starvation among civilian populations ongoing in Yemen. We seem not to have much of a sense of that in the United States. It's not reported on much in the press reports. Keep an eye on that and see what happens. It is a potential flashpoint between Iran and the United States allies in the Gulf. If progress is made on the Iran nuclear front, you may have a dividend that results in hopefully alleviating the humanitarian catastrophe that is ongoing in Yemen. A point I should have made a moment ago when I was talking about Iran is that when the Biden administration gave the briefing to Congress, to some members of Congress on Iran, one of the senators, I believe it was Senator Cotton, but don't hold me to that, one of the senators came out and spoke to the press. Of course, they couldn't tell you what they had been told because it's classified. But he said that it's clear to him that the Iranian government is erratic. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of the Iranians. Just because you don't like somebody doesn't make them crazy. And it's a mistake. It's a policy mistake to assume that Iran is erratic. Iran is a cold, calculating, rational analyst of its own interests. Now, that doesn't mean that they might not get something wrong, but they're not erratic. Their goal, and if they were erratic, that would be frightening. Their goal is regime survival. Our goal is a non-nuclear Iran, non-nuclear armed Iran. Somewhere in there, ladies and gentlemen, it seems to me, lies a deal, lies an agreement. Last thing I want to talk about, and I'll make this brief, and anybody that's ever followed the Middle East and who is as long in the tooth as I am will be amazed that I have waited for the last 2 or 3 minutes. But we have reached a point in 2022 when I talk about the Arab-Israeli issue last, and I'm only going to talk about it for maybe 2 minutes, but that's where we are in the Middle East in 2022. Please do allow me to share the screen for this one, if I can get to the right screen, because I have a chart. So let me see, where do I want to take us? Now, this is, can I get this to move? There we go. This is the photograph. If you're seeing Ivanka Trump looking like she's on The Price is Right, this is one of those policies that is going to have long-term ramifications for the United States that are in fact irreversible. And that is when the United States gave what the State Department calls the crown jewels away to the State of Israel for free. And that is moving the embassy of the United States of America from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Now, the building she's standing in front of and pointing to, telling the contestant he won, It was always there. It is not a new building. It just used to be the U.S. consulate in Israel. They switched them. The consulate went to Tel Aviv, so the sign that used to say embassy now says consulate in Tel Aviv. The sign that used to say consulate in Jerusalem now says embassy in Jerusalem, with a plaque for Donald Trump as president. Okay, fine. That's done. We're not moving the embassy back. And this is actually a minor point. The major thing that the Americans did was to close a consulate in Arab East Jerusalem, which functioned as the base for negotiations between the United States and the Palestinian, what America calls the Palestinian authorities, and which much of the rest of the world, including some of our European allies, some of our Latin American allies, all the Islamic states regard as the state of Palestine. And of course, most of the world regards Palestine as a state. Palestine is not a member of the United Nations, but it has the designation of a non-state, I beg your pardon, a non-member state observer. That is the same status that Switzerland had until 2002. Switzerland deliberately did not join the United Nations until after the Cold War because it did not want, it wanted to remain truly neutral between the two major powers so that it wouldn't have to take sides in the United Nations. So it's got the same status that Switzerland used to have, the same status that the Vatican has now as officially a state. And of course, the International Criminal Court has accepted the ratification of the Rome Statute of the ICC by Palestine. So for purposes of the International Criminal Court, Palestine is a state. Be that as may, the United States does not recognize it as a state. And so the issue is not where the embassy is, that's done. The issue is there a formal diplomatic channel of representation between the United States and the Palestinians? Because not only did the United States close its consulate in Arab East Jerusalem, it closed the Palestinian representative office in Washington. This is the Trump administration. And it took the staff that used to house the consulate in East Jerusalem, which had been there for decades, and housed it in the American embassy in Jerusalem, meaning that formally negotiations with the Palestinians comes within the ambit of the state of Israel. It's not an independent state or an authority that is independent of Israel, but is within the ambit of US-Israeli relations. Now, why is this a permanent change? Israel has de facto control over East Jerusalem. Even the Trump administration did not recognize Israeli sovereignty over Arab East Jerusalem. But it has de facto control. In order for the United States to reopen that consulate, to deal with the Palestinians, Israel would have to approve. And that ain't going to happen. So that is a door that is closed permanently. Now, whether the US reopens the Palestinian representative office in Washington or not remains to be seen. But the Trump administration's worldview was that it could resolve the Palestinian-Israeli dispute without talking to the Palestinians. And I can't explain that to you. I can tell you that was a policy. I can tell you the deal of the century that Jared Kushner put forward was made without any reference to any Palestinian official. The reason this is a problem, and this is the chart I want to show you, is that the Israelis have a fundamental problem, and it's a demographic one. This chart is based on United Nations numbers and the UNRWA, which is a United Nations agency. This chart shows you the percentages of Muslims, Jews, and Christians in the territory which includes Israel proper and the occupied territories. So between the Jordan River and the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean, that chunk of territory, not including the Sinai, of course. And it goes back to 1922 and it projects out to 2035. Now, if you look back at mandatory Palestine, when the Brits ran the place, you had a population that was 78% Muslim, 11% Jewish, 10% Christian. Let's get down to the bottom line here where that last column is concerned. There has been a general de-Christianization of the Middle East. I am sorry to say, throughout the Middle East, numbers of Christians have gone dramatically down. That includes the state of Israel. Of course, the Christians in Israel are Palestinian, and that number is unlikely to go up anytime soon, if ever. It may well go down, not only in Israel and occupied territories, but throughout the Middle East, I'm sorry to say. Look at this. It is projected that in 2025, which is 3 short years less, the Muslim population is going to be 50%. And the Jewish population is going to be 48%. And by 2035, 10 years later, it's going to keep. And that has to do with birth rates, which means that the population between the Jordan, the Dead Sea, and the Mediterranean is going to be majority non-Jewish in a Jewish state. How you square that circle, I don't know. It has been said by experts on the Palestinian-Israeli problem that Israel the day is coming soon. We will blink and we'll be in 2025. I can't believe we're in 2022, and let's not even talk about what how old I'm going to be at my next birthday. It's going to happen real soon. At that point, people who study this issue for a living have concluded that Israel is going to have one of 2 choices. It can be democratic, or it can be a Jewish state. It cannot be a democratic Jewish state. I leave that for you. I don't have any answer to this. I think my personal opinion is a 2-state solution is too far gone because too much Palestinian territory has been taken over by Jewish settlements in the occupied territory. You cannot disentangle the populations and leave a viable Palestinian state. That's where we are. That issue, I think, is going to haunt future administrations. I think the previous administration did harm, but that is going to be a gift that keeps on giving. And with that, I'm sorry I went way over my time, but if there are any questions or comments, I'll be happy to take them.
Mr. Ambassador, you're right on time. It's 3:30, so there is at least 25 minutes for Q&A. And I want to thank the Ambassador. Now we are ready for questions. Please don't type it in the chat box. Just go ahead and raise your hand and ask the Ambassador the question. We want to give the faculty the first opportunity.
While I'm waiting for someone to raise their hand, if I may respond to Mr. Mejdi. I'm aware of that. One of the John Bolton, whom I know personally because he was the American ambassador in New York. I'm looking at the chat here. I don't know if everybody can see that. Many Americans were hoping to persuade Trump many Iranian Americans were hoping to persuade Trump for regime change, but the U.S. military leaders were not for it. I know John Bolton personally because he had a recess appointment as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations when I was there. And he was one of these regime change hawks. All I can tell you is regime change did not go terribly well in Iraq. Iran is a much, much more complicated place than Iraq. I don't know a military leader who thinks it's a good idea for the United States to intervene militarily in Iran to cause regime change. Again, that's no defense of the Iranian government. I'm the last one to do that. I just try to deal with facts.
Next question, please.
Mr. Ambassador, this is Junaid Sharif. I have a question about the Gulf states. At the time that Khashoggi was murdered, there were some speculations that ideologically Qatar and Turkey and a number of other smaller agencies are becoming more like a Muslim Brotherhood, favorites and inclined in that direction. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. By the way, just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, which took place in a Saudi consulate in Istanbul, in Turkey. He needed proof of a divorce from his, I think this is right, this was some personal issue about a divorce from his wife so that he could marry in Turkey to his fiancée. And he was told by Saudi officials, he was critical of the Saudi government. He was told by Saudi officials that he should come to pick up the documents at the consulate in Istanbul. I should say that Jamal Khashoggi was a United States permanent resident. He was a columnist for the Washington Post. Unfortunately, he went. He was seen to go into the to the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. He was never seen to come out again. It is known because the Turks had their intelligence focusing on the embassy. They have recordings apparently from inside the consulate, rather, not the embassy. They have, they had the place bugged. So Turkish officials heard, and a transcript actually was once reported on, I don't know how genuine it is, of Khashoggi being dismembered by a Saudi intelligence hit team that met him in the consulate. If you'll allow me a personal note, I had never met Jamal Khashoggi. We followed each other on Twitter and were aware of one another's work. We had mutual friends. But about 3 months before he was murdered, I was invited to speak at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C. And a mutual friend of ours chaired that panel. And Jamal Khashoggi attended, and I actually met him. And it remains years later a remarkable feeling to know that the man I had shaken hands with and exchanged casual pleasantries with, good to meet you at last, that kind of thing, was literally hacked to death and dismembered. It's an image I can't get out of my mind. Now, let's get to your question. What I didn't have time to talk about, because I spent so much time talking about Iran, is that one of the things that that occurred during the Trump administration was an effort by Bahrain, well, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain to isolate Qatar. When they did so, Qatar had to find friends quickly, because if you look, what they actually did, if you look at the boundaries between these states, including the maritime boundaries, you would actually choke Qatar off, because they don't have. If you fly a plane out of Doha and take off from Doha, and you want to go anywhere, you have to cross through someone else's airspace to get there. They don't have access to international airspace because of the way the borders are drawn. So Qatar needed friends quickly. I mean, they could have actually there was a really important benefit to Qatar. For instance, they couldn't, for several months until this got sorted out under the Montreal Convention, they couldn't import foodstuff. So they created a domestic dairy industry to respond to this blockade. And they now produce their own milk domestically. They don't have to import milk from Europe anymore. Anyway, one of the states that reached out to Qatar was Turkey. And Qatar sent a force of 10,000. Remember, Turkey's a NATO ally of the United States. They're not much of an ally right now, but they're a NATO ally. So Qatar sent 10,000 troops to, and it has the largest army other than the United States and NATO. And they sent their force into Qatar, in my view, as a warning to Saudi Arabia not to attempt a landing there. Now, Qatar has another insurance policy, which is the largest American air base in the Middle East. In any event, it drove Qatar and Turkey together. One of the ostensible reasons for this tripartite blockade of Qatar was that Qatar was supporting the Islamic Brotherhood here and there across the Middle East, in Egypt and in other places. And of course, Turkey and the Muslim Brotherhood are very close. So there may be some truth to that. Certainly, Qatar, for a time itself, was punching above its weight. Trying, for instance, at one point, it suggested that the Arab League headquarters be moved from Cairo to Doha, which was a non-starter. If you look at the relative sizes of Qatar and Egypt and the cultural influence and all of that. And clearly, one of the things Saudi Arabia wanted to do was to cut Qatar down to size, which it somewhat did. But it also drove Qatar to have better relations with Iran, with which it shares the largest non-associated gas field in the world. Non-associated, that is to say, it's not associated with oil production. That is on the Qatar-Iran border, and so it has to have decent relations with Iran. That was also a source of irritation for Saudi Arabia. I would say that blockade has largely failed. It may be that Qatar has pulled in its horns a little bit, but those wounds will take, I think, a long time to heal. The kinds of things and the kinds of demands that Saudi Arabia and its allies made of Qatar are not likely to be salved anytime soon. But there's no question that the foreign policy of places like Qatar diverges from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia favored Hosni Mubarak staying, for instance, as in power in Egypt. Qatar did not. And those kinds of things were indeed a source of friction, as Mr. Sharif has told us.
Mr. Ambassador, if I may ask you a question. You said it was during the Trump administration that the consulate in Israel was made into an embassy. If I don't follow the news that closely. Were the Republicans in power in the Senate at that time? Did they object, or they did not object, or they went along with Trump?
It was a Republican Senate, right? Because the Senate flipped in 2020, barely. After the special elections in Georgia. So yes, it was a Republican Senate. But by the way, I mean, Trump is right about one thing. Presidential candidates of both parties for decades have been saying, if I'm elected, I'm going to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Then they get elected and someone says to them, listen, you know, this is going to cause more problems than it solves. And so they don't do it. What is remarkable to me as an analyst isn't whether Trump moved or didn't move the embassy. It's that he got no concession from the self-claimed greatest deal maker in the world. He got no concession from Israel for having given them a prize they had sought for decades. He gave it to them for free, what the State Department calls the crown jewels. And that's the remarkable part to me. Not that I mean, in terms of actual difference, it made no difference, except that it signaled that the Palestinians simply didn't figure into the Trump administration's calculation on the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, which is, as an analyst, as an observer, a very strange thing.
Okay, next question, please.
Mr. Ambassador.
Yes, sir.
As an ambassador, sir, what do you think will come about the Israel and Palestine situation in years to come? Who is going to suffer the most out of this whole situation?
There is a line from, if you like Broadway musicals, there's a line from one of my favorite Broadway musicals, which is the Man of La Mancha. Whether the pitcher hits the stone or the stone hits the pitcher, it's going to be bad for the pitcher. And I think that in the intermediate term, I mean, the late Edward Said who died, I think, in 2004 or 5, wrote an article a year or so before he died in the New York Times Magazine that the two-state solution was dead. So this is almost 20 years ago that he would have written that Professor Said would have written that. The long term, I think that the Israeli polity, it seems to me, believes, and when I say polity, I mean the political class, but also rank and file Israelis believe they can sustain the status quo into the indefinite future. I don't think it's sustainable, and I think that it will explode at some time. I hope I'm wrong. I'm not advocating for an explosion. I'm just saying I don't think a minority population can rule over a majority indefinitely. Now, that's just the way I see it. But so long as we are in this posture where we do not speak to the Palestinians, where we do not take their concerns seriously, where we do not take I'm saying we, the United States, because the United States is what Madeleine Albright called the indispensable nation. That expression is nowhere more true than in the Arab-Israeli dispute, the Palestinian-Israeli dispute. So long as the United States doesn't take into account a need for a viable, contiguous Palestinian state, I don't think we're going to be able to force the Palestinians to accept what has been called Bantustans. You know, the kinds of apartheid statelets that the apartheid minority government tried to create in South Africa. Well, no South African leader, was going to accept that. And I fundamentally, I'm not trying to make too much of the analogy between South Africa and Israel. Please don't take this the wrong way. I'm just saying that to the extent, look at the map that Jared Kushner. I wish I had added that to my presentation. Look at the map that Jared Kushner made, and tell me it doesn't look like the map that the Afrikaner government tried to impose on the Africans in South Africa. It's just I don't want to get too political, but it's and it isn't political. It's factual, I believe. It's very difficult not to see the analogy. You have to work not to see the analogy. So I'm not optimistic, and I don't think it ends well. And in a world as interconnected as ours is, and becoming even more so, that's not good news for anybody.
So you're basically saying that through all this, Israel is going to be left all alone by itself.
That's possible, by the way, because there's a liberal basis. I mean, liberal in the Burkean sense of liberal, not liberal and conservative the way the term is bandied about in American politics. But there's a liberal basis for the creation of the state of Israel, which this narrative, if it comes to pass, Israel is going to have to violate. And I think that's going to cost it friends. And I'll tell you, Ari Shavit, who is an Israeli journalist, wrote a book saying, look, the danger we as Israelis, this is Ari Shavit speaking, not me. We as Israelis face a danger of alienating American Jewish support of the state of Israel, because we're going to have to become increasingly more illiberal, again, in this Burkean sense of that term, in our dealing with the Palestinians if we don't come to some accommodation with them. And he was saying this, it's got to be close to 10 years ago. The Hillel House here in Bloomington at IU and the center I'm director of, we co-sponsored a talk he gave here on campus some years ago after he published that book. And this, you know, and 10 years later, or however many years it's been, 6, 7 years later, we've lost ground. We haven't gained any ground on resolving, on coming to a resolution of that issue. And you just can't get to a resolution of any issue if you're not talking to both sides, even if U.S. policy clearly favors Israel. Okay, fine, everybody understands that, including the Palestinians. But you still have to talk to the other side to get a resolution.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, sir.
It's my pleasure. So thank you.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions from the faculty.
All right, so there's a question in the chat.
What is the motivation for Trump's withdrawal from the nuclear treaty with Iran? Very difficult to get into another person's head, and I certainly wouldn't want to try that with a former president. But I'll tell you, I think, you know, let me draw an analogy. President Trump, candidate Trump, said that NAFTA was one of the worst deals ever made, other than the Iran nuclear deal. One of the worst trade agreements ever made. And by God, he was going to renegotiate. And he did. He forgotten what the heck, he gave it a particularly inelegant name. I can't remember what it is. US, Canada, Mexico, USCA, ME, USMECA, whatever the hell it is. Okay. And he did it very quickly. Now, anybody that knows anything about trade agreements knows that they can take decades to negotiate. The United States and the EU still doesn't have a trade agreement. So how in the hell did Trump manage to get a trade agreement with 2 of America's largest trading? But by the way, when we impose sanctions against Canada because of a trade imbalance of dairy products, we actually have with Canada, it's one of the few countries the United States actually has a trade surplus with, and had a trade surplus at the time. It's just that it so happens that on dairy products, they have the trade surplus. But in overall trade, the United States has a trade surplus with Canada. Be that all as it may, how is he able, in a matter of months, to negotiate an agreement to modify NAFTA? Well, the reason is that there were problems with NAFTA. Part of it were obsolete. It was negotiated in sort of the pre-digital age and the age of what's it called, intellectual property and all of the, none of that was around in the 90s. How was he able to negotiate all this so quickly? Well, the fact of the matter is the fix had been negotiated, not directly as NAFTA, but as part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which was a trade zone aimed specifically at China. And again, when the United States withdrew from that under President Trump, it gave China a strategic victory for free. But that's beyond my scope. But what Trump was able to say is, ha, I fixed NAFTA. So I believe, and I have no evidence for this, this is conjecture on my part, I believe he thought he could withdraw from the JCPOA, force the Iranians back to the negotiating table, make some changes here and there, maybe extend it another 5 years, maybe make some other relatively quick change, and be able to say, you see, it was the worst deal in the history of negotiation. I turned it into the greatest treaty ever signed. And that's fine if the other side wants to play that game. The Iranians don't want to play that game. And moreover, they're not only unwilling to play that game, they're willing to pay the price for sanctions to get to wherever it is they want to go. And so you can walk away from the agreement, but getting back into it, Trump had one instinct that was much better than his predecessors. I will say this, because I know I've been critical of Trump, but let me say this. He had an instinct that he didn't want to get bogged down in another Middle East war. And so he couldn't help withdrawing from the agreement, but he knew he didn't want to start another war in the Middle East, which was a correct instinct in my opinion. But then maybe there's another way to get the other party to improve what was admittedly a flawed agreement. But you weren't going to get a better agreement than the one we got in 2014. And if we didn't have JCPOA in place as long as we had, Iran may very well already be a nuclear power. And that's a day nobody wants to see.
We have time for one last question from one of the faculty members, if I may say so. And then we have the ambassador has other things to do, and we'll wrap up this program. Anybody has any questions?
If not, let me say it has been a tremendous pleasure. I have enjoyed the questions. The questions were more probing and interesting. I must concede that my prepared presentation, I enjoyed the questions very much. I wish you all well and look forward to another opportunity when we can all be together. And thank you very much, Professor Sashti, for hosting us.
Mr. Ambassador, on behalf of the consortium and on behalf of this group, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for taking time. We are greatly honored. It's a pleasure to work with, hopefully for the next 4 years, with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and other NRCs. All of which directly or indirectly come under your leadership. And we look forward to the opportunity of greatly benefiting from this collaboration. Thank you very much. And all of you have a nice evening. For those of you who are going to leave us, if you have any thoughts on the ambassador's comments and other things, please leave some notes in the chat box. And on behalf of the consortium, I would like to thank each every one of you. We are starting a new program called, and incidentally, we might call the ambassador back again, called a visiting diplomat program. In roughly 3 weeks, we will have the Consul General of Great Britain in Atlanta and also the head of the Welsh government in Washington, D.C. for a 90-minute program with the students, 45 minutes of presentation followed by 45 minutes of Q&A. For those of you who joined the program, I hope you'll give me permission to use your email list. And this is specifically geared for the students from your university, from your college. We hope you will recommend some of the students to join our program, and we hope to continue with this program with Indiana University going forward, because this has been built into their proposal for the next 4 years. Mr. Ambassador, I might as well take the opportunity to invite you to come to this program not too many months from now. Thank you so much. Carl, do you have any closing comments?
Thank you, Ambassador.
Carl?
Thank you very much, Raj, and thanks everyone for coming today. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. I thought it was a very interesting day. It's been a long one though, and so I will keep my comments short and just say thanks for coming, and thanks to Raj for organizing everything.
And a great evening for all of you. Enjoy the weekend and be safe. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Carl, I will catch up with you on after the deadline is over, okay? Have a great day. Bye.